we are really at the cusp of harvesting domestic grown European truffles, and I'll take you through some of the more interesting aspects of that. But let me introduce myself again. I'm Robert Chang, the Chief Truffle Officer of the American Truffle Company. American Truffle Company was founded in 2007, so we're coming up to our 10th year anniversary. So the theme of today's talk is revolution. Well, this is a dictionary definition, but what I wanted to really focus on is what is the status quo and how are we changing that. So throughout the talk today, I'll be talking about what the current status quo is for truffles here in America and abroad. So there are 4 different areas for that we see things happening in terms of the revolution. There is the cultivation piece. Truffles are actually being cultivated. And take a wild guess. What percentage of all truffles coming out of France today is wild? Anybody want to guess? Let's say 50%? 70%? 10%? Actually, only less than 5% of all truffles coming out of France today is wild. Over 95% is cultivated. So cultivating truffles actually is a large industry that's been done in Europe for quite some time, but it is a big challenge here in North America. So the first field we'll talk about is the revolution with regards to the cultivation piece. And then we'll talk about how distribution will be very, very different when we have domestically produced European truffles. And then the other area that comes out of having domestic production is the quality, the incredible change in quality and availability is a huge revolution that we're looking forward to. And then I'll talk about what that means in terms of changing the way people cook, changing the way that restaurants cook with truffles. So just some very basic backgrounds. What are truffles? Truffles are in fact an underground fungus. They're completely underground, you cannot see them, and they live in symbiosis with the host trees. So they are in fact attaching themselves to the roots of host trees, and what we're seeing here are in fact the truffle mycorrhiza, the truffle fungus, on the tips of these root hairs. These bulbous growths on the tips of the root hairs are in fact the truffle fungus, and the truffles themselves are in fact the fruiting bodies that these fungus produce. So that's what truffles are. And before going into the revolution of truffles, let me tell you a little bit about the American Truffle Company and what we do. So as Brett mentioned earlier, we actually help people grow truffles. And what happens is that we have client partners, so folks that have land and want to grow truffles. We actually partner up with these folks and we grow truffles together. So we're not consultants. We don't just provide trees, but we are a long-term partner to all of our client partners. Because the reason for that is that if you do everything correctly and properly, set everything up properly initially, the truffle orchard will continue to produce truffles for up to 60 to 80 years. So it's a very long-term endeavor. And from our side, we provide, number one, the inoculated truffle trees. So these are trees that have been inoculated with the European truffle fungus. We also provide the scientific know-how. Now, the scientific know-how in this case is really important because unlike growing grapes or avocados or soybeans, where the scientific knowledge for growing those things is pretty much out there in the public domain. You can hire somebody to show you exactly what to do. That's not the case for truffles. The science of growing truffles is really not out there in the public domain. So that's something that is proprietary to us, and we provide that to all of our client partners. We also provide monitoring. Just like if you were to grow an apple tree, you can see the tree is doing well, you can see that apples are forming, and that's how you monitor things. But because truffles are entirely underground, you can't see them, but you still have to monitor them. Otherwise, you'll be planting your trees and hoping in 5 years you produce truffles. And for us, hope is not a strategy. So we provide all of these to our client partners who have the land. So the client partner provides the land, as well as the operations, the upkeep and maintenance of the truffle orchard. Essentially, they will operate the farm, and then they will also harvest. And once the truffles are harvested, we actually distribute them. So this is an ecosystem where each partner has very specific responsibilities that we do. And we're very fortunate to have been covered by the New York Times, and our research, our technology has been featured in TED Talks, as well as on the BBC and many other publications. One thing I want to bring to your attention is that as part of what we do, we actually put on the Napa Truffle Festival every year. So Napa Truffle Festival typically takes place on the Martin Luther King weekend in January, and has 4 very interesting components. We always have we always invite Michelin star chefs to come and showcase the best of truffle cuisine. So we have truffle lunch and truffle dinner. We also have a very well attended truffle cultivation seminar in which my business partner, Dr. Paul Thomas, who is one of the top truffle scientists in the world, go over the basics of growing truffles. And there's also actually an opportunity to visit a truffle orchard in operation in Napa with cute truffle dogs finding truffles in the truffle orchard. And then there's a large truffle marketplace that we put on as well. So if you want to find out more, just go to the website napatrufflefestival.com. So, okay, what is the first and foremost thing that we're doing very differently? The cultivation piece is very, very different. I want you to remember that number, 98%. Actually, it's greater than 98%. That's the status quo. What does that mean? I'll come back in a second. So, the revolution in truffle cultivation really starts with the fundamental processes that the steps that are required to actually produce a truffle. So you actually start with well-inoculated truffle trees, and you have to manage those trees. You have to manage your orchard scientifically and rigorously. So I often make the analogy that growing truffles successfully is like raising children. You have to have 2 components, nature and nurture. If you're missing either one, you're not going to be successful. So nature, in this case, comes in the form of truffle trees, and nurture here is how you actually run your truffle orchard. How much water do you give the trees and truffles and many other things. And then again, this is the very important piece. You have to monitor things. You have to verify. You have to test what is going on, and if you do everything correctly, then you can expect to harvest truffles. So that's conceptually what the process looks like. Now let's take a look at what the status quo is. People actually have been trying to grow truffles for over 20 years here in this country, and without much success. So let's take a look at what people are doing in each of these respective areas. So the truffle trees in this traditional approach often come from independent nurseries. So these are nurseries that have tried to inoculate truffle trees, and they sell the truffle trees, and their main business is as a nursery to sell trees. Now, on the management side, once you get your trees, that's where the challenge first arises. You are completely on your own to figure out how to manage the trees, how to prepare your soil, how to prepare your orchard so that the trees will actually thrive. And as I mentioned earlier, the science of growing truffles is actually not out there in the public domain. And so this step is very, very challenging. It has been very challenging for most folks. And then monitoring in the traditional way is done kind of haphazardly, not a consistent, rigorous process. So and none of these three ever talk to each other. This is an independent nursery. This is not any kind of methodical approach, and the independent labs have no idea how the test results relate to what the truffles actually need, because again, the scientific knowledge is not there. So theoretically, you can produce truffles, and people have produced truffles using this approach. However, this is where the 98% comes in. In over 98% of the time, people actually do not produce truffles. And so there's an extremely high failure rate with this classic status quo approach. So how are we trying to improve that? Well, so this is what we do. With our approach, we have our own high-tech nursery. Part of the technology that is important for growing truffles is to inoculate the trees properly. Everybody has their own way of inoculating trees, but there are pitfalls, and there are things that only very rigorous science can produce the most compelling trees. So we have our own high-tech nursery. Second, we actually provide the proprietary scientific methodology to our client partners. So our client partners are no longer reliant upon information that's out there in the public, which really, unfortunately, is not scientific and is often based on myths and misinformation. So that's the second component, and the management methodology is done very, very rigorously and consistently. And then we monitor things. So we know what's going on under the soil. We know what's going on the roots of the trees. So, and all of these things are integrated. If we find that something is not exactly right through the monitoring, there's a feedback loop that goes back to managing and tweaking things, tweaking the soil, for example, tweaking the way that the environment is set up for the truffle trees. So that's an integrated approach, and we have produced truffles. So it is a proven methodology that has shown to work. One thing I want to point out, which is very important from a scientific perspective, as you probably notice, we're very heavy on science, and that's the crux of what we do. Everything is based on science, very rigorous science. So in fact, my business partner, Dr. Paul Thomas, he's actually based in Europe, based in the UK, he looks after the European market, whereas I look after the North American market. So between Paul and me, we've actually had the opportunity to establish truffle orchards in 25 countries around the world, as far north as Finland and Sweden, and as far south as South Africa, New Zealand, and Australia, and in many places in between. And why is that significant? Well, because, as you can see, these locations, these orchards, span 4 continents over an enormous area of climates and soil conditions. And in each of these truffle orchards, we actually have scientific instruments sitting in each orchard, collecting information every second of every day and sending that information to us over the internet to our server in California. And so this, in fact, is by far the largest truffle scientific database anywhere in the world. This is what really enables us to walk into a new situation and know exactly what to do, because we have the data for it. There's rarely any soil condition that we don't have data for. There's rarely any microclimates that we haven't seen. So when everything is said and done, this is probably the most fundamental differentiator in terms of what we do. All right, so let's talk a little bit about distribution and how distribution is being changed. So the status quo in terms of distribution, the way that truffles are currently distributed from Europe is a truffle distributor here in America typically gets 1 or 2 shipments a week. And so, you know, typically it could be a Tuesday or a Thursday shipment, and then they turn that around and sends them to chefs or sell them to other folks. So we're going to be able to harvest daily and ship daily. So we're no longer limited by the shipping frequency. So if a restaurant, for example, wants to have the freshest truffles possible, we can ship every single day. Every day you'll have fresh truffles. You don't have to have truffles sitting around for 2, 3, 4, 5 days. When you wait for your next shipment. So that's the first difference. And as a result, the freshness is very, very different. The status quo, if you're doing 1 shipment a week, then the truffles that you get will have to last you through the next week. So by the end of the week, your truffles are, 5, 6 days old. Whereas, again, the way that we're trying to change things is you can have consistently hyper fresh truffles every day if you like. Now, traceability. Traceability is something that really hasn't been done in the truffle industry, and that is, today when you get truffles, it's very difficult to know where exactly that truffle comes from and when exactly was that truffle harvested. Could have come from France, could have come from Croatia, could have come from Italy or Spain, could have come from a week ago or 4 days ago. You have no idea. It's very difficult to trace. Whereas because we control all the growers in our community of client partners, and we handle the distribution, we have the ability to trace every single truffle to its origin and exactly when it was harvested. So that is something that is unique, and we hope is going to make things a lot easier for people to understand the freshness aspect. And then last row here, authenticity. That is something that is actually a fairly big challenge, because some of you may know there was a piece in 60 Minutes about a year ago on truffles, and it turns out that there's a species of truffles called tuber indicum that looks identical to the real Paraguay black truffle, either from the outside, even if you slice it open, even after you put it under the microscope and look at the spores, it's indistinguishable from the European Paraguay black truffle. And yet, that species, Tuber indicum, actually has very little flavor, very little aroma. But in shipments coming from Europe of Paraguay, what's supposedly Paraguay black truffles, we actually have found Tuber indicum mixed into it because naturally people try to cut the real thing with this much less expensive species. So authenticity sometimes can be an issue, the way that we actually approach this is we run our truffle trees, we run our truffles through DNA analysis, so we know it is for sure it's the real thing. I mentioned earlier that the Napa Truffle Festival is something that we put on every January, and we invite Michelin star chefs. So we've done it for 7 years. Over these 7 years, we've accumulated quite a roster of the top Michelin star chefs, both in this country and also even in Italy. So these chefs know about us, and many of them cannot wait for the hyper-fresh truffles that will be produced. And this is the great news now, because not only will we be making hyper-fresh truffles available to restaurants and top Michelin star chefs, we're going to make them available to the general public. And e-commerce, being able to buy truffles over the internet is nothing new anymore. That's not a revolution. People have been doing that for many years. But what is different about the way that we're trying to go about doing it is the freshness piece, the hyper freshness that come with it. Also, the traceability. You know exactly where the truffle comes from, exactly when it was harvested. So in our shipment to our customers, for example, you will get a traceability statement. This truffle was harvested by Sparky, the truffle dog, yesterday at 4 p.m. from this farm in this location, right? So you can't get any more specific and any more accountable than that. And that's what we would provide, the traceability part. And again, the truffles will be authentic because we have done DNA analysis. We know that these are the real McCoy. And by the way, all of our scientific management methodologies for running the truffle orchard, all of that is organic. So all of the truffles that our client partners produce will be organic. So all of these together will be available to the general public. And if you like to be the first ones to be notified when this becomes available, you can sign up at americantruffle.com. So let's talk about the quality and availability a little bit. So again, we're probably the biggest truffle geek that you'll meet. So this is a little bit technical, but the idea is actually very easy to understand. So there's this concept that truffles are highly perishable, right? But exactly how perishable? Well, it turns out that truffles have a half-life of about 5 days. So every 5 days, it loses half of its aroma and flavor. So this is days after harvest. When it's harvested, let's say it has 100% of the flavor. After 5 days, you're down to 50%. After 10 days, you're down to 25%, etc. So you can see how truffles lose their flavor and aroma very quickly. Now, this is what the status quo looks like. By the time that we get a truffle imported from France, from Italy, even from Australia. Even in the best case scenario, it's at least a week old. And what does that mean? Well, that means it only has about 1/3 of the original intensity and flavor left. 2/3 are gone. And on top of that, that's when the restaurants actually receive them. Now, because restaurants typically are on a weekly cycle, weekly ordering and receiving cycle, the truffle that you get today delivered to you is going to have to last you for the next week. Well, by the time that next week comes around, your oldest truffle in that batch is going to be 2 weeks old. And it only has a little over 12%, in fact, 1/8 of the original intensity and aroma. So that's the real challenge that we face today for any truffles that are imported. And that's the status quo, right? Now, so what are we trying to do? We are, because we have direct relationships with our client partners who are growing truffles, we are able to get truffles harvested and sent to you, to the restaurants, within a matter of 12 hours. 12 hours, you lose about 5%, which is a far cry from the 2/3 of the flavor that you lose. Now, even if it takes an extra day, let's say FedEx messes up, all right, it takes an extra day, or you receive the truffles, you don't use it for another day, you're still looking at 82% of the original intensity and flavor. So if you compare what can be achieved with the way we're trying to do it versus the status quo, you can see how extraordinarily significant the freshness difference is. And I'll talk a little bit about the cuisine and what this extremely fresh truffle means to cuisine. To talk about that, I'm going to talk a little bit about the kind of the chemistry, the science of truffles. So the reason that truffles are so fragrant, that they have such an incredibly addictive aroma, is pretty much chemistry. It has a very complex set of volatile organic compounds that it's giving off. And as soon as a truffle is harvested from the ground, it continues to emit all these compounds. In fact, that's the reason that it emits those compounds is such that in nature, because truffles are entirely underground, when they become ripe, they start releasing these aromatic compounds so that animals can find them and eat them and disperse them, and that's how they spread themselves in nature. So if we look at the main chemical components, we have various components that are sulfur compounds. Most of these contain sulfur in them. This one is noteworthy, 2,4-dithiopentane. Why is that noteworthy? Because it's one of the key chemicals that are found in truffles, and why that's important will become interesting in a second. But knowing that these are the chemicals responsible for the truffle flavor and truffle aroma, we actually have direct implications on how to cook them and how to hunt for them. So, for example, if we look at these top compounds and we look at the boiling point and the flash point, so this is the point where, this is the temperature that these compounds vaporize into the air. So, and as you can see, they're pretty low in terms of the flash point. And so that's why when you cook with truffles, you actually don't want to cook with them. That's why most of the time truffles are used raw and shaved. So if you look at this one, 2,4-dithiopentane, if you heat it above 109 degrees Fahrenheit, it's gone. So if you cook your risotto with truffle and you let it sit there and cook for 20 minutes, you're not going to have truffle risotto. You're going to have risotto with little specks of black things in it. That doesn't taste anything like truffles. So don't overcook the truffle. Some interesting tidbits about truffles. So these chemicals are fat soluble, alcohol soluble, but not water soluble, which means that when you cook with truffles, that's why having butter, having cream, having some kind of fat is very, very important, because that's the carrier that carries the truffle flavor. Same thing with alcohol. Who has had truffle-infused vodka? So yes, that is one thing that is actually real, you can do. Now, notice it is not, these flavors are not soluble in salt. So what does that mean? That means truffle salt really does not carry any of these flavors very effectively. So now, part of this truffle revolution is really about authenticity, is really about getting the freshest truffles available to the end user. And so I just have to talk about this. I know a lot of chefs really talk about this too, and that is most of the truffle oil on the market today that you find, even in very reputable markets, if you look at what the ingredient list is, you'll see, by and large, it's some type of olive oil, and it might have a little speck of the actual truffle in it. Here they have 0.2%. And then you have something called flavors. What does that mean? Well, remember our friend from a couple slides ago, 2,4-dithiopentane. That's the chemical that was synthesized in the 1970s when food scientists figured out, oh, okay, this is the stuff that makes truffles taste so good. So, in fact, most of the truffle oil that you can get today is in fact synthetic. And as a result, it's quite one-dimensional, because in a natural truffle, there's upwards of about 300 chemicals that make up that complex flavor profile. But if you use truffle oil, it's just one. Now, some people would say, well, having truffle oil is better than not having any truffle flavor at all. Well, that's a subjective thing, but what we have found through doing the Napa Truffle Festival and through having talked to many, many chefs who actually do not use truffle oil, the challenge with using truffle oil is that because it is so strong and people use them, and you get used to that very strong and almost like, it's almost like getting hit in the face by the truffle aroma. So that when you actually have a real dish made with real truffles, where the flavors are a lot more subtle, you can't taste it and you can't appreciate it. So every year at the Napa Truffle Festival, we get, gosh, 15, 20 pounds of the freshest truffles available, and we have 3 to 5 of the top Michelin star chefs to showcase them. And invariably, every year we have people that come that come back and say, hey, I can't taste the truffles. Well, using too much truffle oil has the real danger of desensitizing your palate and to the point of maybe ruining your palate. So, to summarize, there are a number of things that we're trying to do differently in the truffle world, and I'll talk a little bit about why those matter and what the benefits are. So, again, everything is based on science. What we're trying to do is to be rigorous, 100% rigorous about growing the truffles, about educating folks on how to properly use truffles, as well as every aspect that goes from the orchard to the kitchen, including shipping. All of that is science-driven. We invest in ways to best preserve the truffle freshness and truffle flavor during transit and minimize that transit so that the implication and the benefit there is clear. And the science really means that the truffle orchard project that someone undertakes is no longer subject to 98% failure rate, but rather it's going to be almost 100% successful. Our track record so far is not 100%, it's not perfect, but it's pretty close to it. And the second piece of the revolution is, again, the quality, the ability to have truffles so fresh that only 5% of its original intensity is lost when you receive it. And the benefit, of course, is the hyper-fresh truffles that are available, will become available to chefs and to the consumers. Now, this is going to be a slow ramp-up time. We're not going to be producing tons and tons and tons of truffles like people are importing from Europe. So it's a gradual process through which the yield will become more and more. So that's the caveat. And then through being able to harvest daily and ship daily, it means that no restaurant should store its truffles more than a day or two. And if you want the freshest of the fresh truffles, we can ship them to you every single day. So for more information, go to AmericanTruffle.com. Any questions? Yes?
The trees that you use for your plantations.
Yes.
Are they going to be primarily hazelnut or oak, or I think also willow works?
Right, so the question is, the trees that we use for our truffle orchards, what type of trees are they? We use primarily oak trees and hazelnut trees. And even though there are many other different species of trees that can be inoculated, for example, willow trees, walnut trees, pine trees, but the reason that we use oaks and filberts, hazelnut trees, is that we have the most data on those trees, and we know what the yield is going to be. Right. Yes, sir. Yes. The question is, how do you store truffles once you receive them? So I'll tell you how you should not store them, and then I'll tell you how you should store them. So often you'll hear people say, oh, when you get your truffle, you should store them in rice. That's the absolute worst thing that you can do. The same reason that rice works so well when your iPhone drops in the sink to suck all of that water out is the reason that you shouldn't use it for truffles, because you'll desiccate the truffles, you'll draw the moisture out. So don't ever use rice, because rice is not a fat, is not an alcohol, it doesn't absorb truffle flavor. So the way you should store truffles is wrap them in paper towel individually and put them in a sealed container either in a Pyrex or in a Ziploc bag, and leave them in your refrigerator, and don't freeze them. Once you freeze your truffle, the aroma changes, the texture becomes really soggy, it's not very good. And then you should change the paper towel daily. Right, but first and foremost, use it as soon as you get it. And, right. Any other questions? I like your outfit. Yes. So the question is, how do we work with our growers after the truffles are harvested, right? So, one of the things that we do is that we help distribute the truffles that are produced, and so we have our distribution channels. Instead of each grower figuring out and reinventing the wheel and trying to create your own sales and marketing machinery, we do it centrally. And so when the truffle is produced, we will actually minimize the time in transit. So let's say if Gabriel Cruther, our Michelin-starred chef in New York, wants truffles this Friday, we'll get one of our truffle farms on the East Coast to harvest truffles, let's say Thursday afternoon, and package them and clean them and be ready for FedEx pickup, so that the next morning they show up in the kitchen in New York City. So that's typically what would happen. So to ensure freshness. Yes, sir.
So to find your truffles, you need a good dog. So do you lease a dog to your growers, lend them out there for the season, and then bring them back?
So the question is, what about the dog? In order to find the truffles, you actually need a dog, a trained truffle dog. So we actually, that's part of the know-how that we would transfer to our client partners. So our know-how includes the knowledge to professionally train the truffle dogs. And then there are different ways of doing it. We have professional truffle dog trainers already standing by that can train your dog, or can find a dog and train it for you. Or we actually even have truffle dog training curriculum already developed that you can do over the internet, and you can take that and train your own dog at your own pace. Yeah. So I think we're up to our time limit here. And any last questions? So the question is, what is the initial establishment cost for creating a truffle orchard? So it's on the order of, on a per acre basis, on the order of about between $15,000 and $20,000 per acre, and that's not including land. So that's assuming you have the land. So between $15,000 and $20,000 to get started, and that's an all-inclusive budget. Cost of the trees, cost of soil amendment, irrigation, pretty much everything that you need to get started. Average, yeah, good question. So the average revenue that you can expect when things get to a point where you can reliably harvest truffles is on the order of between $30,000 and $40,000 per acre per year. All right. So, and if you're into numbers, the rate of return, the internal rate of return (IRR) is about 32% for the investment. Okay, I think we've run out of time. Thank you for being a great audience, and I hope to be able to supply really fresh truffles to all of you soon. Thank you.